After Theodore, the toys got more complex. Some worked and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back to his workshop and recycled them for parts, though she did not like to watch although she did not like to watch them dismantled. But the ones that were kept, those she loved, and they were here now, looking at her expectantly, smiling. Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave a stiffly not, but not happening. She pushed it again, holding it down longer, but this time across the room, and a weary creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. The unicorn, Charlie had named him Stanley for some reason she can no longer remember, was made of metal and had been painted glossy white, had trundled around the room on a circular track, bobbing its head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Charlie kneeled beneath him on the floor and patted his flank. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lovely, gazing out of the decay. You need a new coat of paint, Stanley, Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of her bed was a wheel made of patched together metal. It always reminded her of something she might find on a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stuck for a moment, then gave way, rotating as it always did across the room. The smallest closet door swung open. Out sailed Ella on her track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands, like an offering. Ella's plain dress was still crisp, and her painted leather shoes still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had in a fictional outfit back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet again. The door closing behind her, Charlie followed her. The closets had been built a line with the slant of the ceiling. And there were 3 of them. Ella lived in the short one, which was about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was one a foot or so taller, and the third closet was a bedroom door. Was the same height as the rest of the room. She smiled, remembering. Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the question. 'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively to the littlest one. That one Ella's anyway," she added. John nodded, satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door in the middle to the middle closet and tried to. The knob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled a few times but gave up, without much conviction. She stayed crouched low to the floor to gaze at the tallest closet, her big girl closet that she would someday grow into. You won't need it until you're bigger, her father would say. But that day never came. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way to time. As she moved to stand, she noticed something shiny, half hidden under the rim of the locked middle door. She leaned forward to pick it up. It looked like a broken off piece of circuit board. She smiled slightly. Nuts, bolts, scraps, and parts had torn up all over the place. Once upon a time, her father would say, had stray parts in his pockets. He would carry something he would be working on and around, set it down, and forget where it is, or worse, put something aside for safekeeping, never to be seen again. There was also a strand of her hair clinging to it. She unwound it carefully from the tiny limp of metal it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up Theodore. His back had not faded in the sun, like the front of his body. It was the same rich dark purple she remembered. She pressed the button on the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless. His fur was threadbare, and one ear hanging loose by a single rotting thread, and through a hole she could see the green plastic of his circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. Oh, lie, the rabbit said with a barely honorable halting noise, and Charlie sat him down, her face hot and her chest pinched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. I love you too. Charlie looked around the room. As a child, she had been her own. It had been her own magical world, and she was positive of it. Only a few chosen friends were ever allowed inside. She went to her bed and sat Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her. The little unicorn came to a halt. She went to the back door to the driveway and stopped in front of the garage. That had been her father's workshop. Half buried in the gravel a few feet away was a piece of metal, and Charlie went to pick it up. It was jolted in the middle. It was jointed in the middle, and she held it in her hands, smiling a little as she bent it back and forth. An elbow joint, she thought. I wonder who that is going to belong to. She had stood in the exact spot many times before she closed her eyes, and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor of her father's workshop, playing with scraps of wood and metal as though they were toy blocks. Trying to build over the tower of uneven pieces. The shop was hot, and she was sweaty, grime sticking to her legs, and she sat in her shorts, and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp metallic odor of the soldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the unicorn. Stanley's face was still unfinished, one side white and shining and friendly, with a gleaming brown eye that seemed almost to see. The other half of the toy space was exposed, circus boards and metal parts. Charlie's father looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back, beloved. In a darkened corner behind her father, barely visible, hung a jumble of metal limbs, a twisted skeleton with burning silver eyes. Every once in a while, it gave an uncanny twitch. Charlie tried to never look at it, but as her father worked as she played with her makeshift toys, her eye was drawn back to it again and again. The limbs, contorted, seemed almost mocking the thing, a glacially gesture, and yet there was something about it that suggested enormous pain. "Daddy," Charlie said, with her, and her father did not look up from his work. "Daddy," she said again, more urgently, and this time he turned to her slowly, as though not fully present in the world. "What do you need, sweetie?" She pointed to the metal skeleton. Does it hurt?" She wanted to ask the question, but when she looked into her father's eyes, she found she could not. She shook her head. "Nothing." He nodded back at her with an absent smile and went back to his work. Behind him, the creative grave of with of the creative grave the creature gave another awful twitch, and its eyes still burnt. Charlie shivered and drew herself back into the present. She glanced behind her, feeling exposed. She looked down, and her gaze fixed on something. Three widely spaced grooves in the ground. She kneeled thoughtful and ran her finger over one of them. The gravel was scattered away. The marks worn heavily into the dirt. A camera toppled of some sort. It was the first unfamiliar thing she'd seen. The door to the workshop was cracked open slightly, invading, but she felt no desire to go inside. Quickly she headed back to her car, but she stopped as soon as she settled into her car, into the driver's seat. Her keys were gone, having probably fallen out of her pocket somewhere inside the house. She retraced her steps, merely glancing into the living room and the kitchen before heading up to her bedroom. The keys were on the wicker chair beside Theodore the rabbit. She picked them up and jiggled them for a moment, not quite ready to leave the room though, but the room behind. She sat down on the bed. Stanley the unicorn had stopped beside the bed, as he always did. And as she sat, she patted him absently on the head. It had grown dark while she was outside, and the room was now cast in shadows. Somehow, without the bright sunlight, the toy's flaws and distortion were thrown into sharp relief. Theodore's eyes were no longer shown, and his thin fur and hanging ear made him look like a sticky vagabond. When she looked down at Stanley, the rust around his eyes made them look like hollow sockets, and his bared teeth, which had always thought of as a smile, became the awful knowing grin of a skull. Charlie stood up carefully not to touch him, and hurried toward the door, but her foot caught on the wheel besides the bedroom. She tripped and the tracks and fell sprawling on the floor. There was a weird spinning metal, and she raised her head. A small pair of feet appeared under her nose. Clad in shining painted leather, she looked up.